Welcome to the San Diego Museum of Art Guest Lecture Series, brought to you today by the docents of the SDMA. Today's lecture is titled Italian Renaissance Naturalism, What It Is and What It Isn't. But before I begin, I want to remind you that during the lecture, you'll be able to ask questions of our speaker in the chat function. I want to let you know that following the talk, there will be a virtual tour led by our own Allie Arnell, who will be taking you on the after lecture tour, highlighting the art of being human, the Renaissance and beyond. My name is Bea Barraza, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome not only today's speaker, but his parents, Fred and Angel, who are joining us from their home. Dr. Christian Kleinbub is professor of art history at Ohio State University, where he teaches and studies the arts of the Italian Renaissance. His particular focus is on issues of image theory, naturalism, the human body, and period conceptions of vision and the visionary. His first book, Vision and the Visionary in Raphael, winner of the 2013 Gustav O. Arlit Award in the Humanities from the Council of Graduate Schools, considers the important ways in which an influential Renaissance artist attempted the reconciliation of contemporary demands of painting and the traditional functions of sacred images. His other publications on this subject include The Visibility of Angels, The Five Senses, Printmaking, and The Ideal of Painting and Sculpture, which have appeared in edited volumes and leading journals such as the Art Bulletin, Renaissance Quarterly, Word and Image, and the Burlington Magazine. His latest project, Michelangelo's Inner Anatomies, explores the poetic, philosophical, and scientific dimensions of Michelangelo's understanding of the internal organs and a crucial but neglected aspect of the master's work. He also serves as co-director with his wife, Amanda Glebizip, of the new Foundation for Art History. The foundation was created to support the field of art history and to foster the best current research in the discipline. Please welcome Dr. Christian Kleinbub and today's lecture on the Italian Renaissance and the concept of naturalistic imagery.
Thank you so much, Bea. It is a great pleasure and honor to be here, and I thank you and everybody else at the San Diego Museum of Art for making this possible. It is a blast from the past in the best of ways to be able to talk about this topic and to focus in my lecture on images from the San Diego Museum of Art in particular. It was my home turf museum. And in many ways it still is when I'm able to travel to see my parents and my brother who still live there. It was my parents who had the inspired idea to take me to the San Diego Museum of Art and to the Timken Gallery in Balboa Park when I was very young. And I think that it was probably the impression of many of the brilliant works in San Diego that caused me to be interested in the field I now practice. So San Diego gets my thanks as well. A magnificent city with magnificent things, perpetually underjudged by people who do not know enough. And then without further ado, let me move right into my talk. Italian Renaissance Naturalism, What It Is and Isn't. I wanted to start by looking at one of the oldest works in the European paintings collection at the San Diego Museum of Art. This is a work by Lorenzo Veneziano. It shows at the center the Virgin and Child, the crucifixion above them,
help me get to this.
And saints and angels as well. This is a gold ground picture, as we tend to say in the profession. Meaning that there is no real space or background that you can see in this 14th century picture. This was how most pictures looked in the later Middle Ages in Western Christendom. not just Italy, but elsewhere. They were inspired by the example of Byzantine religious art, which was imported into Italy in the 14th century and even beforehand. Works of this kind were often disassembled later by collectors or on account of the ruinous condition. And many of the good gold ground pictures you see at the San Diego Museum of Art and at other American and European museums were once part of these larger architectures, like the Veneziana that I just showed you here. These works were meant to stimulate contemplation and prayer, and their gold grounds were some help in that. They reminded the viewer of the work that these weren't people of their own space and time, but rather hallowed figures existing in an internal space, a celestial one that was beyond the reach of the senses. And we know from writers of the period that works like these were not meant to simply stimulate the physical senses like our eyes. They were meant ultimately to generate intellectual, that is, abstract thoughts about the deity, sanctity, or whatever religious mystery they had portrayed. Needless to say, these works reveled in their very artificiality, and there's no way of denying their extreme beauty. But in the course of things, a new theological outlook erupted in the West, right around the time in which these images are being made. Perhaps driven by the Franciscan order, people began to want more sensuous images of the divine. They wanted corporeal images that could make especially the mysteries of Christ's incarnation, his taking on of flesh on earth, more present to the viewer. And so it happens that the naturalism that is widely ascribed to Italian Renaissance art in many ways is the outgrowth of a religious devotional function as it grew and prospered over several centuries. And one of the things I want to emphasize in these remarks I make today is not only some of the main lines in which naturalism traveled from these early roots in gold ground painting, I also want to point out how this religious source, this impetus coming from religious practice, meant that later art of the Renaissance and the Baroque and periods beyond them still bore the imprint of this original devotional ideal. And so as we move through this lecture today, I hope you'll pay attention to the fact that Italian Renaissance naturalism is certainly special. It opens the doors to all sorts of other naturalism, including secular modes of naturalistic portrayal. But all of them ultimately have a deep genetic heritage that is attached to this late medieval, early modern moment. Now, the painting I chose as my title image is a wonderful work by a student of Leonardo da Vinci. This work is by Bernardino Luini, and it shows the conversion of Mary Magdalene, or at least that's one title you could give this picture. It was probably painted near the time of Leonardo da Vinci's death, which was in 1519. This is probably a year or two afterwards. And it exists now, of course, in the San Diego Museum of Art, where it is one of the best masterpieces of the collection. You can see immediately, I hope, that it bears no great resemblance, at least in the way it portrays its figures, to the way that Lorenzo Veneziano made his figures in the polyptych on the left of your screen. Instead of seeing a gold ground, we have a murky, neutral background of shadow. Instead of figures who seem plainer, flatly inscribed, as it were, and colored upon the celestial surface of gold. We have figures who seem to occupy three-dimensional space. These sorts of things make the image on the right, the Luini, feel a lot more like it exists in our own temporal space and time. It seems to be a palatable image. The figures seem like they could speak to us, and we can relate to them perhaps more directly than we might the figures we see in the Veneziano on the left. But as I have already outlined, the purpose of this lecture will be for you to see, I hope, how this Luini depends ultimately on the Veneziano. Now, the gold ground was ubiquitous in paintings of the 13th, 14th, and even 15th centuries. In fact, this work by Sano di Pietro, which shows St. Catherine of Siena, dates from the middle of the 15th century, which is quite late in the history of Italian art to see gold grounds of this kind. The gold ground seemed to cause some concern with artists and patrons who wanted to perhaps make their images more palatable, as I mentioned. And so in San Diego's own museum collections, we can begin to see a few strategies for dealing with this problem, if you want to call it that. On the right, I'm now projecting Carlo Crivelli's Madonna and Child, a relatively early work by Crivelli from around 1468, again in San Diego. And you'll notice that this Madonna, beyond being slightly less flat looking than the St. Catherine on the left, is from more or less the same period. But I also want to note that her background, rather than a flat one of chiseled or tooled gold leaf, is one where we see hanging luxurious fabrics, a red cloth of honor, embroidered or woven with what seems to be ornamental vegetal patterns, and then behind it, a gold brocade. These are objects of the luxury world of the 15th century, which you would see in numerous holy spaces where they were used as altar cloths, or in palaces where they might actually be hung behind princes or people with power. And here you might be able to see how Crivelli, looking to that gold ground, is attempting to naturalize it. He's attempting to find its equivalent in the world of the physical senses. And so one of the first ways in which we see Renaissance artists in the 15th century deal with the gold ground is by finding things like cloth of gold embroidered that they can hang in back of their personages. The personages then can stand somewhat proud of that surface rather than we seeing them as flattened against it. Another strategy can be seen in San Diego's collection. The attribution of this particular work is uncertain. It is currently given to pseudo Pier Francesco Fiorentino, who is not a household name. And we have here another Madonna with Child and with roses. This is painted not long after the Crivelli that we just looked at. You'll see here that instead of backing the Madonna with a cloth of honor, or for that matter, the gold leaf ground of gold ground pictures, the artist has chosen to show an entanglement of roses against what probably was a blue sky. Now, already then we have a sense of space in back of the Virgin and Child that isn't a flat one, not absolutely in any case. We sense by way of the blue paint behind those flowers that space continues beyond. And yet, those flowers seem to practice an astonishing hors vacui. They try and fill in with their tendrils and blossoms every available portion of that background, giving it almost something like a tapestry background. You might forget that it is, in fact, a representation of natural things, in this case, plants. The lintel in front of the Virgin Mary, which we saw before in the Crivelli on the right, is also a play by the artist to give a sense of a greater three-dimensional space, to deflatten what was the gold ground work that had preceded it. This work on the left, the one at San Diego, isn't, though, the first by any means to try this strategy out. I'm projecting now on the right a wonderful work by Gentile da Fabriano, one of the great innovators of the 15th century, the early 15th century. And this is his Madonna and Child from quite a bit earlier, some 60 years earlier than the Madonna and Child with roses. And this is perhaps the first painting in Western art to do away with the gold ground. This is a debated issue. I probably shouldn't speak in absolutes here, but this is a good candidate for the first picture that survives of that kind. And you'll see that Fabriano decides, instead of a gold ground, to give us something like a portal or a lintel carved of stone, apparently three-dimensional, as we can see by the shadows he paints inside of it, and filled, again, with blossoms and fruits of plants. In a way, this picture is attempting to do much the same thing as the pseudo Pier Francesco Fiorentino on the left. But this is where we arrive by 1515. In this Bugiardini, we have a Madonna and Child with St. John and angels. They are placed in what you might call an architectural surrounding, though they're not enclosed by buildings. The wall, the stone wall on which they are seated, has a sense of architecture about it. In the background, we see a landscape. And instead of a cloth of gold or plants or roses, we see sky inhabiting the space behind the Virgin's head. This, in many ways, becomes the new convention for such holy scenes, where things like a skyscape or a beautiful landscape, which imply the hand and glory of the creator, you can kind of find a substitute for the gold grounds seen in earlier images. And so we can start seeing in San Diego's collection the basic trajectory that gets us to pictures like Bugiardini's that are not so different from the paintings we might expect of a realist painter today in our own time. Now, there's other innovations, of course, that need to be discussed in this context, though I can't discuss every permutation of them. Another important one that many of you probably are aware of is linear single point perspective, this key invention of we will see that this comes into being very slowly. The ideas that lead to single point linear perspective come into being rather slowly over a great distance of time. And here I'm starting you out another of the early 14th century pictures of San Diego's collection. This shows the Virgin and Child with saints, with a crucifixion on the right and an Annunciation on the pinnacles of the wings. And you'll see that this is, by our standards at least, a very naive treatment of space. The Virgin seems to be seated on a throne. She is certainly elevated on what appears to be a step above the places of the saints that flank her. And before her, under her feet, flowing over that step, is probably an oriental carpet, or at least as an image of how an oriental carpet might have been painted in this moment. There is a sense then of three-dimensionality in this image, despite the gold ground, but it isn't necessarily terribly effective. You'll notice that the Virgin can be easily read as just hovering vertically on some sort of plinth rather than being seen in deep perpendicular space in this painting. Another work in the museum's collection allows us kind of move a step beyond the triptych. In this very early work by Fra Angelico, A Madonna and Child to the Dead Christ and Saints, we see an artist who would become a major innovator in the 15th century, trying out some of the same spatial tricks. His Virgin is also seated on a throne raised on a step. The step is portrayed in a way unnaturalistically, insofar as it seems to be tilted towards us somewhat. We don't quite believe in its three-dimensional occupation of flat, receding space. But we do sense some spatiality in the little pink box that we see above her head, which is the tomb of Christ, in which he appears in the scene above them, where he's venerated under the cross by the Virgin Mary and Saint John. In that little box, that little tomb or sarcophagus that Christ is shown popping out of, you see that the sides recede in space on diagonals, orthogonal lines. And that is, in many ways, a fairly sophisticated attempt for the first years of the 15th century at getting space right, three-dimensional space right, when it comes to rectilinear forms. It is, in a way, ancestral to single-point linear perspective itself. Single-point linear perspective, however, is something we can see very clearly in this work by Masaccio on the right, which is now in the National Gallery in London. Shows a Madonna and Child enthroned. And I think I would argue that this is the first painting in Western art that uses single-point linear perspective effectively, and makes this work, of course, an important moment in the history of painting. The perspective isn't over-involved. We don't have, for instance, a large building or a cityscape shown to us here. But the throne of the Virgin Mary is indeed shown competently, more than competently and well. The Virgin, for almost the first time in the history of Italian painting, seems to occupy a believable three-dimensional space. The throne seems to surround her on both sides. She seems contained in it as a statue might be in a niche. And what is more, we see that step, which we've met before in earlier examples, from head on, in a way that implies less that artificial tipping upwards that we see in the Fra Angelico on the left, and more of a recession in against perpendicular space, backwards into the background. The angels are shown being actually in back of the throne, appearing actually in back of the throne as well. And the use of light and shadow by Masaccio famously endows all of these things with a certain logic, a single light source that makes them feel three-dimensional and real and occupying real space in real time. Now, perspective appears in this later work that we've already seen, the Bugiardini, in that wall. You'll see that there are two babies in this painting, Christ, who is held up close to her mother's heart, and Saint John, his slightly older cousin, who kneels on the parapet that conveniently emerges from the wall in the viewer's direction. And in that parapet and its moldings, you will see that Bugiardini, like most artists of the early 16th century, has come to master at least the basics of perspective. And he's decided to combine that perspective with his control of aerial perspective, that is the murkiness of distant objects in the background, to give us a sense that, in fact, we as viewers appear before the Virgin and Christ and St. John and angels in a space that's almost an extension of our own. This, you might say, is the the kind of the latest iteration, at least in the Renaissance, of the devices we've been discussing. But landscape is an interesting thing. Landscape itself becomes a genre or mode of painting that becomes extremely popular at the end of the 16th century and the 17th century. And of course, it remains so today in our own time. Landscape, which in essence had its birth as a background to replace gold ground in early Renaissance pictures, soon kind of develops its own independent life. And in works like the Pietro Perugino, which actually may be by his student, Lo Spagna, the penitent Saint Jerome in San Diego's collection, you can see how these landscapes over time become popular in themselves as great settings, appropriate settings to religious subject matter, as reflections of beauty associated with the divine creator himself. And over time, not only do they come to surpass or rather supplant the gold grounds of the early pictures, but they come to take up more and more of the figure space of the painting as well. And that's what we see in the Saint Jerome, the penitent Saint Jerome on the left, where the saint is praying to a crucifix. The crucifix is hidden in that small tree above the lion. And yet the center of the picture, the geometric center point of the picture, is a deep landscape. And we might compare this painting of St. Jerome to another haunting image in San Diego, this one in the Timken Gallery, showing the parable of the sower from the New Testament. Still a painting that has a religious theme, of course. The parable of the sower famously tells how faith in God is planted in different soils. Well, I should say faith in Christ is planted in different people, like it can be planted, like a seed can be planted in different soils. And just as the seed might fail to thrive in certain dry ground or ground that's covered with thorny plants, it won't thrive in the heart of sorry, someone's ringing my doorbell. It will not thrive in the heart of the evildoer, whereas it will thrive in the fertile ground of someone who is open to God. And this parable then gets transformed into a beautiful rural scene by Peter Bruegel the Elder, who was not an Italian artist, a Flemish artist of the 16th century. And this is one of his earliest paintings. I'm showing you it here because some people address paintings like the Peter Bruegel the Elder as being essentially pure landscapes, despite the subject matter, biblical or otherwise, that they sometimes carry at their centers, like this one does. But you can see perhaps in this comparison from San Diego pictures, how you get from a devotional art where the first interest was making more present the divine personage portrayed in the work, to a point where that background has taken over, becomes an object of fascination in of itself, and in fact, eventually its own independent way of painting and representing the world. I wanted to return, though, briefly again to the Crivelli that I mentioned a moment ago, this early Crivelli in the museum's collection, because at the very top and the very bottom, you will see elements of what we would call still life painting. At the top, near where the cloth of honor is hung, you will see quinces or apples, strewn as you would strew them into garlands for celebration or to give honor to a particular person or image. And in the lower part of the painting, you see that lintel carved, it seems, with a letter attached to it, meant to fool our eyes into thinking that maybe it actually sits on top of the actual surface of the painting. Crivelli, as he developed as an artist, became ever more invested in such still life elements in his pictures. And by the time you get to this marvelous painting now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, another Madonna and Child, you really can see this at its most impressive, or nearly its most impressive. Those small quinces have taken over the upper part of the painting, and they're joined by a cucumber, which was a symbol of resurrection. So you know, these all generally have symbolic functions. The cloth of honor has been, well, it's been retained at the center, you see in the pink fabric, but the gold embroidery behind it on the left has been replaced by a landscape setting. And so though the Virgin and Child are posed before the viewer within a shallow space behind this lintel and in front of this cloth, you also see how your eyes can travel back into the distance. Now, still life is becoming an ever increasing object, you could say, of distraction in some of these early religious images. And it occurred to me when putting together this lecture today that we might say that just as landscape grew out of the need to dispose of the gold ground, still life grows out of needs to perhaps cement the image in space in the foreground. And if we look at yet another Crivelli, even later than the last one, this one again in the National Gallery in London, you can see how many of the things I've been discussing come together in a religious picture. This is an image of the Annunciation. The Virgin is shown kneeling in prayer on the right, indoors in her bedroom. It's a wonderful portrayal of a glamorous room of the period. You'll see the luxurious curtain drawn back on the bed itself. Above her, we see the balcony of a palace where there are plants, an oriental carpet, and a peacock, another symbol of paradise and resurrection. And on the left, we see in the sky something that some naive people have described as a UFO, but is actually a sacred cloud. And from that cloud is a ray of golden light that enters the Virgin's house. There's even a little gutter hole in the pink marble cornice through which it can pass. And there it goes into the room and passes into the Virgin's ear. And many times you'll see in Annunciations rays of light or the dove of the Holy Spirit traveling to impregnate the Virgin Mary through her ear. This is because, as St. Augustine pointed out, the Word was made flesh. The only way for the Word to be made flesh would be if the Word is heard. So, of course, there was no intercourse that led to Christ's conception, and conception was in the mind by way of the ear. And so this painter is showing that very elegantly in this marvelous scene. You'll also see other figures. In fact, a whole cityscape and a bit of a landscape opens on the left. We have a perspectival grid laid out for a checkerboard-like floor that allows for these buildings to seem to naturally recede in space on diagonal lines that coalesce towards the single point of the vanishing point in the background. And in that space, in the lower section, you'll see an angel, that is Gabriel, who first announced to the Virgin, presumably here through the window, that she would conceive. And he or she, angels have no gender, is joined by Saint Emilius, who is carrying a little town model. And this is a model of the town for which this work was commissioned. All of this busy, natural detail buzzing around the Virgin in prayer as the incarnation comes to pass is maybe potentially a distraction from the sacred nature of the scene itself, even as it may symbolically enhance that subject. Here, I would like to point, however, to two specific things. First of all, the still life elements that you might see below. There is a cucumber and a quince or apple on the ledge. The cucumber even seems to protrude into the viewer's own space. And they're wonderfully done. Well, here's another marvelous detail of that peacock and the rug and the plants above. But here you see the cucumber and quince seated on the ground, and they almost are like a signature of Crivelli himself. You expect to see them by this date in most of his paintings. And they have almost developed an autonomous life of their own, even within this larger sacred scene. They remind me, I have to confess, of probably the best picture owned by the San Diego Museum of Art. It's extremely rare and sublimely beautiful Khotan, which is his still life from about 1602. The Khotan is actually a Spanish Baroque picture, obviously from the 17th century, but it's a very, very early still life. Still life as an independent genre of painting only really takes off at the very end of the Renaissance in the 16th century. But as I'm showing you in this comparison on this screen, Crivelli and other artists of the Renaissance itself really set the table, as it were, for these later still life works in religious images. Once again, the naturalism of Italian Renaissance painting, which was intended to increase the reality effect and thus the relatability of sacred persons and scenes, has become something with a mind of its own and has now been able to be spun off to become many different things. My point here and elsewhere in the lecture is you don't have things like landscape or still life in a vacuum. In many ways, we wouldn't have them at all without devotional painting. Looking again too at the Crivelli Annunciation itself, I'd like to point out that those straight lines, the grid-like structures of the bars on the windows, the tiles on the sidewalk, the lines between the various floors, the moldings of those buildings, all of them might strike us as both beautiful and effective and decorative, at the same time that they may also feel artificial. There's nothing necessarily wrong with the artificiality of any painting. One of the things I want to always say when I talk about naturalism is you do not need to necessarily prefer, say, this image over a gold ground painting, which is less naturalistic. Paintings have other virtues beyond their naturalism that can be, in fact, more important. But it does seem that by the end of the 15th century, some artists had in fact grown somewhat frustrated with the linearity and just the general outlininess, you could say, of art like this by Crivelli, who was in fact a somewhat eccentric and conservative artist for his moment. By the early years of the 16th century, we have some of the great masterpieces of all time being produced that are known to all of you, like Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. This is a portrait, although it may not be a portrait based only on one person. That's a complicated story in itself that I don't have time to go into here. But I do want to point out in this image, which comes roughly 20 years after the Crivelli, that you no longer have that sense of linearity. You no longer have the sense of having to deal with line and grid everywhere you look. Instead, you have a sense of space that is largely conveyed not by single point linear perspective, but rather by things like modeling, by the use of light contrasted with shadow on the figure and through aerial perspective in the background. The diminishment of forms like the mountains, here seen through mists of a greenish or bluish purplish hue, those things seem to be effective enough for Leonardo to do his magic. And in fact, you will see them in much contemporary 16th century portraiture as well. Two great portraits in the museum's collection, the Giorgione, one of very few that exist, the portrait of a man from 1506, and the Tintoretto portrait of a man from about 1550, which I do think is a Tintoretto, an autograph one. These two wonderful paintings show you how the linearity of Crivelli has been largely banished from certain types of painting. And these two artists, by the way, are Venetian, who are exposed to some of Leonardo's innovations. And they make the point that a neutral background that isn't in any way crisply cut off from the figure itself comes to be predominant in this very time. It was Leonardo's insight in the Mona Lisa and earlier pictures that there were no straight lines or sharp lines in nature. You have to imagine that in the Renaissance, there was not much by the way of artificial light. Candlelight, lamplight were among the few things you could light an interior with, and daylight was hardly enough in most crowded cities in the daytime. People were used to living in shadowy conditions, and people like Leonardo da Vinci actually suggest that other painters paint in the late afternoon when they're doing a portrait, because the shadows aid in making the image look as three-dimensional as possible. Leonardo, having mastered single-point linear perspective, banishes it to the portrayal of only certain things. He thinks that it might work well if you have to represent a building in three-dimensional terms, or say the corner of a table, like the one you see in his pupil's painting here on the screen. But by and large, unless you have bright artificial light, as we do today, and even then, these sharp lines, that linearity we love and sometimes notice too much in 15th century art, was something that probably shouldn't be in a perfectly naturalistic painting. And Leonardo attacks it. He develops a technique that some of you probably have heard of before, sfumato, which means smoked or smoky in Italian, which means that he blends the contours of his works and uses all-embracing shadows, except in highlight places, to give a sense of continuity to his figures in a scene. No longer do they stand proud at all of the enveloping environment in which they are shown. Instead, they kind of fade back into it. They join it. They are one with all that envelopes them. And there's a certain density to the air in works like this, and of course, the Mona Lisa, where the air almost feels humid, and because of this sfumato technique, has almost its own substance, miraculously recreated in the picture itself. So sfumato, you could say, is in many ways the last answer ultimately to the gold ground, because instead of using linear perspective, sfumato backgrounds of this kind might give a religious image, and this one is indeed a religious image, something like a neutral background that is more believable than any gold ground or frankly cloth of honor could be in itself. But we can't say that it became the only background for figures. Bugiardini, who is aware of some of Leonardo's inventions, is sfumato is here and there palpable here as well in this tondo. He shows us towards another reaction, another way of portraying the divine. And this is where I get to those things that can't be naturalized in Italian Renaissance art. So far, I've been talking about the things that Renaissance art did to make the supernatural or the divine look natural. But there were certain things that were strict limits on what naturalism could do, because after all, they are theological phenomena, at least in Christian theology. that stand beyond all human sight, at least physical sight. And the landscape setting allowed some artists to try and naturalize even those supernatural things that technically could never be seen by our physical vision. I want to look back in time real briefly to pick up this thread of my argument to a wonderful work in San Diego's collection, again, remarkable that we have one, Giotto's God the Father adorned by angels. And you see the head of God the Father there at the center towards the pinnacle top of this triangular element as worshiping angels look at him from below. Some of them covering their eyes because, of course, God from the Old Testament onwards is known and often shown to be basically unseeable. You remember that Moses could not gaze on the face of God. He only got to see the rear end of God after he collected the 10 Commandments. And unlike Christ, God the Father, in Christian theology, didn't need to take on a corporeal physical body. That was the job of his Son, who took on human flesh and was able to be seen and experienced by the physical senses during the period of his incarnation. God the Father was therefore a troublesome thing for painters who were trying to imbue their images in the Italian Renaissance with greater and greater naturalism. How, when we've abandoned the gold ground, they must have wondered, how do we go about showing God the Father, who cannot be said to exist in any approximate terms, in bodily, physical terms? Of course, I should rush to say that it's not like this question was a new one in the Renaissance. You see in Giotto's work here in the early 14th century that he's shown as an older man with a beard. This in itself goes against, you could say, what we know from the Bible of God the Father, since he is technically and perfectly unseen. And yet, the human image is taken up, and the older male image in particular, as a sort of substitute, as a way of symbolically representing God the Father to us mortals who otherwise cannot experience him in the flesh. Now, God the Father continues to be a bit of a nuisance in terms of portrayal in Renaissance painting. Over almost 2 centuries, you see his form evolve. And here, by the time you arrive at San Diego's Signorelli, the coronation of the Virgin, you see that the old man now seems much more embodied than he ever was in the Giotto. He's still worshipped by angels with instruments. But here he is there to join his son to the Virgin in their celestial marriage, which is a mystery of Catholicism, right? The coronation of the Virgin doesn't exist in Protestant theology, as far as I know. Signorelli, I shouldn't say they, his workshop may have been involved, but Signorelli made the executive decision in this work to show these figures, these divine figures, and specifically God the Father, who cannot be seen in visual terms here. But he replaces the gold background of Giotto, and he replaces the landscape background you might have expected to see in other works of this kind with a rainbow. He chooses, you could say, the most wonderful or extreme permutation of natural meteorological wonders to substitute for something that the mind couldn't grasp, which was highest heaven and the form of God the Father there. In other words, instead of showing just a natural landscape in the background of the scene to represent the heavens generically, Signorelli has reached for a particular weather effect, you might say, that seemed to set him, God the Father, and the divine persons apart from ordinary reality. Though we may see a rainbow once in a while, particularly in certain places where it rains, it isn't a common thing. And it was always thought, as you know, as something divine. There were artists who thought about these issues so much, though, they were not comfortable even with Signorelli's extrapolation from the skyscapes of contemporary painting. And you might think of one of the great artists of all time, a particular favorite of mine, Raphael of Urbino, in this context. Raphael, more than any other artist of the Renaissance, thought about this conundrum of how to represent super sensible things, supernatural for being beyond the physical senses. And I'm showing you here two of his greatest altarpieces, the Madonna di Foligno on the left, which is now in the Vatican Museums, and the Sistine Madonna, which is now in the Gamaldi Gallery in Dresden. These two sublime works show the Virgin Child, one of the great subjects of art, as we see in this period, elevated above the ground, floating on cloud, stabilized somehow that way. And on the left in particular, in the Madonna di Foligno, you see a rainbow supporting that cloud, or otherwise in the distance. For Raphael has decided to combine things like the rainbow and the landscape in his telling of the scene. He makes the excuse, the naturalistic excuse for showing the Virgin and Child, a pattern of the weather, a passing storm. We actually can see rain falling in that ruined city in the background, so wonderfully painted in the Venetian manner. So Christ and his mother are seen appearing on the face of something like the sun as the clouds part and a rainbow blossoms in the distance. And as these wonderful little angels, you'll see are painted to look like they're made out of cloud, part the cloud itself so that we can see them. Raphael is going much further, in other words, than Signorelli ever would, and in the San Diego piece did, to show how there could be a continuity between things that are technically beyond sight and the things of this world that we can see. The Sistine Madonna on the right does much the same thing. The curtains you see there sag on a heavy cord. They're like the curtains that probably would have been covering many altarpieces like this one in actuality in the churches in which they were hung. Those curtains would be drawn back during Mass or on feast days, so the devout couldn't always see them. But here they're drawn back mysteriously, and we see the Virgin descend a cloud-like stairs with her son, as the cloud itself seems to be pouring into the foreground, pouring into the space of the viewer, as Saint Sixtus points to us and kind of commends us to the Virgin. Now, in this painting, we get a clue as to how we might see these supernatural things, because those cloud putti, those cloud angels in the background, give us a bit of a hint. In Thomas Aquinas, the medieval philosopher, in his Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas explains how we might see certain supernatural things and personages, even though we do not yet possess the higher forms of vision that the physical eyes cannot see. And he says that angels can shape cloud and color it into the form of various sacred persons like Christ or the Virgin Mary. And thus what we see with our eyes is not those persons themselves, but rather a divinely wrought angelic painting of them that we then venerate because it is given to us miraculously. And so Raphael really begins to probe the very limits of, you could say, the naturalism of the Italian Renaissance, trying to push it to places even that would have startled people even a generation before him. Not all artists took this tack, though, and I want to complete this short talk by pointing to two remarkable images that I think have some bearing on this theme. I hope you can see that this image by Lorenzo Lotto, the great Venetian artist, is in fact a vision of the Holy Trinity. like in Raphael, we have the vision hovering over a landscape. It's very much like the Madonna di Foligno. It seems to be an emanation of a vision that comes to us as part of a meteorological event. It is something like the weather transpiring before us, some especially strange and tumultuous storm is clearing, and in its wake, we find Christ revealed with the dove of the Holy Spirit above him. You might initially ask where God the Father is, and I hope my face doesn't cover the upper reaches of the painting, because what you'll see there, cut out, as it were, of this golden fund of light that is not gold leaf, it is not a gold ground, you'll see the barest silvery white outlines of an older male figure. This is God the Father, shown by Lorenzo Lotto as kind of the absence of any color or drawing, kind of a cutout of the unseen Godhead looming like a shadow cast in some supernatural way by Christ himself, who lowers his hands, kind of mirroring the upward held hands of that fatherly figure. This is an artist who was extremely devout, as most of them admittedly were at the time, who has thought deeply about the conundrum of representing a figure who is technically beyond any seeing. And yet he finds this weird way in this natural weather event vision to show or indicate or point to something beyond all sight, to give us the barest essentials of it in order to indicate something beyond ourselves. These are now then the limits of Renaissance naturalism. And I think works like this actually help to show us that Italian Renaissance naturalism wasn't after the things we tend to assume it must have been. It isn't after merely getting a transcription of the things of this world right. In fact, it worked the other way around. All the genres of secular painting that we so admire today have their origins in attempts to make the divine palpable to man. And I would end finally with a Baroque ceiling, a work of the Italian Renaissance, but the Italian Baroque. Here we see a work by the Jesuit artist Pozzo. It shows the glorification of Saint Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. And it opens, you could say, in the ceiling of Il Gesù in Rome, a great late 16th century church that was the headquarters of the Jesuit order. This is a big masonry vault that looms overhead in this church, a very wide barrel vault. And yet you would not know it when you're below Pozzo's painting. Pozzo, the artist of the Baroque, like all of his contemporaries, had looked back and developed the techniques of Italian Renaissance naturalism in religious painting and taken them as far as they could. And like Raphael's own strivings, here he opens the ceiling, the vault of a very heavy church, to this infinite panorama of the divine beyond it. This was ultimately, I would suggest in this talk, the real aim of Italian Renaissance naturalism all along. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to take questions or...
Thank you very much. This is Mary Grillo, and we have set many questions for this wonderful lecture from Christian. And so I'd like to start off first with a question on how did the human body come to be naturalized over the course of the Italian Renaissance? You referred to it many times throughout this lecture.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, and it's one that I had to leave out by and large for the sake of time. But you'll see in the slides, as you just mentioned, that beyond these other innovations like landscape, skyscape, still life, etc., perspective, the human body is also coming to be understood in better and better terms, at least by the standards of naturalism. The proportions of the human body, which early on were only partly known, you might say, come to become more natural. And if we look at a comparison like this one, you'll see that the body very often comes to be elongated. The proportion of the head to the body is figured out. The head is often smaller in Renaissance paintings than it was in earlier late medieval art. And so also a sketching from life and the dissection of real bodies allowed artists to do anatomy better. And St. Jerome here isn't perhaps the best example of this, but you can surely see that the artist here in the early 16th century understands things like the rib cage, the shoulder bones, the muscles of the arm and torso. And so in general, this is yet another technique that I couldn't mention, whereby the divine body, since it's almost always a body, is made more present and living and relatable by Italian Renaissance artists through their naturalism.
Thank you. Another of our members asks that, well, first states that she's noticed that contemporary religious paintings by artists like Maggie Masselter, Paolo Medina, or Ruselska are so abstract and flat that they seem to have drawn inspiration from the Byzantine style and Renaissance styles. Do you see a particular trend in religious art today toward naturalism? And if so, who would you refer to?
That's a hard question. There's not a lot of good religious art, in my opinion, being produced anymore. I will, though, say that abstraction increasingly is an optional style today. In contemporary art, it is no longer the signature of authority to work purely in abstract ways. Now, many artists have returned to the naturalistic tradition and figure painting to carry out their work. So I imagine that though there's some spiritual abstraction certainly out there, some of it very compelling, the artist today has a number of choices when taking up a religious subject. And I think good things could be done in any of those. But my mind is failing to come up with a name of an artist I fully admire doing religious art right now, I have to say.
All right, thank you. Can you comment on the phenomenon of Sienese art retaining the Byzantine characteristics later than other areas of Italy?
It's a very good point, well observed. So the Sani di Pietro that you see on the screen here, the Bishop Sabinus, we think, this is an example of Sienese art. You'll see that this picture is from the middle of the 15th century. In places like Florence and even Venice, no longer do you have so much gold. Already the gold ground is largely driven away, you might say, in those places. Siena has a very rich early tradition of painting. And that's kind of emblematized by Duccio, the great 14th century, early 14th century painter of Siena. And I think, although I'm not an expert on Sienese painting, what is often said, at least casually amongst people like me or more Florence-oriented, is that because of Duccio's authority, those painters in Siena felt less need to move beyond it. There are other explanations often trotted out. One is that Siena goes into decline. It retains some of its wealth, but it does not keep up with Florence as a banking or a mercantile center in the 15th century. So that may have something to do with it too. But artists often in Siena also seem to be deliberately archaizing. And that's a very complicated issue. It may be that there are spiritual reasons afoot in Siena that cause the artists there to want to maintain this tradition, which is often one that is seen as conservative, but has its own innovations if looked at closely. So that would be an attempt at an answer of an excellent question.
you. And finally, I'm afraid we want to make sure we have time for our after lecture tour. So I'll take one more question. And I was wondering if you could speak to the contrast in the images of Mary Magdalene and Martha in our Luini.
I'm going to pull it up here. Yes. So one alternative title for this painting, and one that I might prefer, is Mary and Martha. In the New Testament, some of you may know the Mary Magdalene may have a sister. This is debated by theologians. She may be the Mary of the siblings Mary and Martha. And in that case, you know, Martha is the one who does the housework, you could say, or does the drudgery, whereas Mary is able to spend her time contemplating spiritual matters. And in the story in the New Testament, Martha complains to Christ himself, who's there with her, about the way in which Mary doesn't help her out with the chores. And Christ basically tells her, I don't remember the exact words, that these are both viable or useful modes of being, just modes, but Mary's, the contemplative one, is the better kind. So, depending on what title or what iconography you determine goes with this painting, this could be Mary Magdalene, who is the contemplative, with Martha, or it could be Mary. It could be the conversion of the Magdalene, which is the title given to it here. One reason why the Mary and Martha title has been done away with is that Mary should be, in a way, the one pointing upwards, if it's a Mary and Martha. Because she's the one who's paying attention to higher spiritual matters rather than lowly earthly concerns. And the gestures, in any case, probably are meant to spell that out, where the figure on the left pointing upwards, this is a gesture you see in a lot of Leonardo paintings. She's pointing to things beyond sight, beyond vision, beyond any naturalistic telling. That is to God. Whereas it seems with the deflecting gesture, this figure on the right, maybe Mary Magdalene, maybe not, she has a perfume vase often associated with the Magdalene. She's more focused on earthly things, or at least that gesture seems to kind of block this idea, the heavenward idea from her. So the gestures are meant to reflect, to put it succinctly, on the heaven, pointing towards heaven on the left, and more secular earthly things on the right. And if this is the conversion of Mary Magdalene, this may be a figure, say, representing the church or divine wisdom, trying to convince her through argument. You see the left hand seems to be laying out a proposition there, to turn from her life as a prostitute and a lover of luxury to a spiritual contemplative life, which of course Mary Magdalene ultimately does do.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have to say the comments we're receiving are absolutely raves about the quality of this lecture. We cannot thank you enough. People are saying that it's the best one we've held yet. Don't tell our other participants. So I can't thank you enough. And I would like to now turn to Allie Arnell, our docent who will be leading our after tour lecture. Allie, you're very lucky. She has been here with the museum for over 10 years. And I was certainly lucky enough to have been trained by her. And I can promise you an excellent tour from Allie. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Kleinbub. That was just a remarkable presentation. And I feel like just having heard from you for just 1 hour I've learned so much about the Renaissance and about naturalism in the Renaissance. So thank you again.
Thank you
And
very much.
I am going to, it's hard, this is a hard act to follow, but I'm going to do my best because what I'd like to do now, I'm going to be sharing my screen with you. And so we have been focusing with Dr. Kleinbub on Renaissance and what is naturalism and what it is and what it isn't. And I think we all have gotten a much better understanding of that from him. So I'm so pleased. But now what I'd like to do is focus on one small area, specifically on the art of being human, or how artists use the human form to connect with their audiences, to perhaps express ideas, emotions, and how that happens in the Renaissance and also beyond. So we are going to be looking at works of art from our collection, the San Diego Museum of Art's collection. And we are going to be looking at we're going to be exploring some Renaissance artwork, but we'll also look at works from other times and places. So let's begin. And we'll start here. Now notice the gold ground. And of course, now we are also so familiar with this gold ground and understand when we look at this date of 1475 that this is a later work with a gold ground. And you can see the punch work around the heads of the main two figures. And that punch work actually would tell us exactly which workshop this was made in, but we don't know the name of the artist. Now you can see two angels looking at the Madonna and child. So of course this is Mary and Jesus. But what I'd like to do, of course, is focus a little bit more on the relationship of Mary and Jesus as we see it in this depiction. Because we are kind of searching for moments of how artists use the human form to connect with us in this instance, or perhaps express ideas or emotions. And notice Mary's hand. Look how her hand is touching the face of Jesus. And we all know that gesture, right? We've done that ourselves to our children, or perhaps somebody has touched our face with their hand. And that is such a human gesture, right? A gesture of our world. Notice too the way that Jesus is nuzzling against Mary's face. Again, another aspect of humanity in this devotional work, which purpose is to be in people's homes to aid them in their devotion in the Christian faith. But notice that beautiful moment between this mother and her son. And then notice too, it's hard to see, but if you can see the hand of Jesus has his hand kind of engaged in her veil. So this little child is holding the veil of Mary. And so all of these little gestures that this artist has depicted here help us as human beings engage with this work of art. And as Dr. Kleinbub has told us, of course, there's not too much naturalism here. There's a little bit of shadow and so on. So this is a work that is still thinking about divine things, right? Divine issues. But even in that, we see this lovely moment of connectedness between mother and child. So this artist is actually bringing our world into this work of art. But what happens when you have a toddler? Those of us who've been around toddlers know you better watch out. And here, look at this toddler and look what he is doing. First of all, he is reaching out beyond what this picture that I've shown you, and I'll show you the rest in a minute. But you can see his mother, and again, this is Jesus and Mary. This is a devotional work. You can see his mother nuzzling his head, right? You know how it feels against her face, those curls. But you can see that he is almost arching his back a bit. You can imagine he's going to slide right off her lap and get going. And we understand this, right? We have had this experience. So this brings us into this devotional work and helps us connect with what is happening. But what is he reaching for? Well, he's reaching for this walker that perhaps his earthly father, Joseph, who is on the left here, might have made for him. We know that Joseph was a carpenter, and he wants to get off and get to that walker. And so when we look at this painting, we can see Mary is sitting actually on her mother's lap. And then Jesus is sitting on Mary's lap. They're all kind of on one side of the composition, and then Joseph is on the left side. Notice how their heads are all lined up, almost like a Roman frieze, a sculpture. And we know in the Renaissance that artists were looking to Greek and Roman artistic motifs as sources of inspiration. So we're getting that here. Notice too the amazing color, right? We have this beautiful orange and lavender on the left. Venice, this was made in Venice by Catena, was a place known for incredible color. And those of you who have experienced Venice know the light of Venice that reflects off the water helps make colors so beautiful there. And here, this is a painting from about 200 years later. By the way, this campanelli had just been built in the time of the painting. We'll look at it again. But I just wanted to remind you of how that water, the reflection of the light on the water, would affect the artist's eye. So when we go back to this painting, we also know that Venice was known for color because it was so close to the East and so traded with the East, and many new types of minerals that could make these incredible colors were there as well. You can see, of course, this landscape in the distance, and Dr. Kleinbub told us about how this evolved, and it's so interesting and so exciting. These devotional works, as Dr. Kleinbub told us, were really the beginning of a whole history of works of art that continue to this present time. So these are the beginning of many images that were not devotional in nature, but express the love between a mother and her child. And so we're going to explore back and forth between the Renaissance and works from other time periods and places. And let's do that right now. Notice how this mother is gazing down at her child. Look at how she's protecting him with her hand. Notice that the mother and the child are one solid object. Notice too that the background has basically been eliminated so that we can focus on this mother and child. This is a work by Alfred Ramos Martinez, and it expresses that love between mother and child that we already have seen in these devotional works. And it is definitely one that comes from the place of the Renaissance, and also from things that he has explored in his own culture. So notice, by the way, he was educated in the classical ways of making art. He was responsible in Mexico for schools all over Mexico, outdoor schools that people could come to and learn how to make art in new and unusual ways. And so he brought the history of art with him, his knowledge of the history of art with him, but also his knowledge of the history of the art of Mexico that was made prior to colonization. So he really was inspired by the art of the Mayans, the art of the Aztecs. And we can see that here. Look at how he has created almost a sculptural effect in the face of the mother. Notice her hands. Those hands are very similar to sculptures made prior to colonization of Mexico. And so he's bringing that knowledge along with his knowledge of Renaissance art and the art of the West together to create this very moving composition of mother and child. He was known as one of the founders of the Mexican Renaissance. And we've been talking about Renaissance today, that rebirth of interest in Greek and Roman motifs. He was really one of the founders of a rebirth of interest in early Mexican art that came prior to colonization. So we're seeing a merging of the Renaissance ideas and also the ideas of Mexico. But we need to explore some more Renaissance works if we're to complete our adventure of thinking about the human form as a way of artists to express ideas. And we've already seen this, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I thought it would be really exciting to be able to see a close-up of God the Father, as Dr. Kleinbub was talking about. because I think this is really unusual for us to be so close. We won't be able to see it this close again, this big again, once we get back into the museum. And what we're seeing here, as Dr. Kleinbub had told us, is God the Father being depicted as kind of an old man. But I want you to look a little closer, because notice, first of all, he has kind of bags under his eyes, right? Circles under his eyes. His cheeks are sunken. Notice we can now see the little teeny brushstrokes that create his hair and his beard. And he is looking at us calmly, and we can relate to him. You know, if we were walking down the streets of Florence in 1330s, we might see a gentleman just like this person. And so God the Father is somebody that we can relate to, and perhaps that helps us relate to our true God the Father in the Christian religion. He was not made like this. So look, we're looking at this, and at the same time in the Renaissance, we see depictions of gods, Roman and Greek gods, that look like this, right? Huge, powerful figures, scary kind of. Look how things are blowing around him. He's kind of bursting out of that scene that he's in. And so Giotto did not decide to make a god as gods had been described in sculptures from Greece and Rome. He decided to make a god that we could identify with. And that's very interesting. So this artist has taken the human form and made it in a way that we can identify and relate to, which is quite nice. I just want to remind you that this is what we are looking at, which is that pinnacle, which is actually part of, at one time was part of a larger composition, part of an altarpiece that you can go and see today if you are in Florence. And that altarpiece looks like this today. About 100 years after the altarpiece was made, the portion that we have in our museum was cut off. And so when you go to Florence today and see this altarpiece, this is what you'll be looking at. In its day, it would have fit here in this way, and there would have been other pinnacles as well. But I think it's very interesting to be able to see where it came from and to notice these solid figures, the solid figure of Jesus and Mary. They are grounded in space, right? Dr. Kleinbub has been talking a little bit about that today, and notice too these solid figures as well. And now God the Father is in his place, and we see him and he sees us, and we can relate to this work in so many ways. But we also know that angels were being depicted, and over the time in the Renaissance, angels start to look more and more like us. And look at this particular angel. It's kneeling. What's it kneeling on? Can you see? It's kneeling on clouds, very stylized clouds. It almost looks like a pattern, right? And it's kneeling firmly on those clouds. Notice that the artist here has used lights and darks, light color and dark color, to create a sense of three-dimensional form, to create a sense of a human form in a way. Notice too that the angel's wings, the golden wings, they look like birds' wings, right? And they're very detailed with their feathers. And finally, because we are exploring how the human form connects with us, or perhaps gives us a certain, relates to us in certain ways about feelings or ideas, notice the gesture here on the chest. Notice how the angel is actually pressing their hand to the chest. And this might be a gesture of devotion. They're looking on a scene. This is actually part of another, must have been part of a larger painting. Looking on a scene and having that gesture, that's something that of course we all relate to. And just showing you those angels from about 100 years or so earlier, and how that relationship has changed in terms of the way they are depicted. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think we had a very nice discussion of this when Dr. Kleinbub was talking about this, but notice that St. Jerome is looking up here in the tree. Notice too the way his hand is in motion. What is he looking at? Well, he is looking at this figure of Christ who is on the cross. And so when we look at this part of the picture and not really be able to see what this is, we are following his eyes and we're looking at the way his expression, what his expression is saying to us. And I would think that each one of us would have a different conception of what that expression means and that gesture, right? But this artist brings us into this work of art using this human form. And as we have already noticed, very much like how we are in this world, very naturalistic. So I'm going to move from the Renaissance and I'm going to move way far away, time and place. But I wanted to just make a point that I think that was made earlier, but I just want to reiterate it. And that is that you're seeing two saints made in different parts of Italy. This one was made in Siena, and we had a question at the end of Dr. Kleinbub's discussion about Siena, and he said something about the fact that in some artists in Siena might have held on to certain motifs. For instance, the gold background and the way that this saint is made, as opposed to this much more naturalistic saint in a landscape. And this happens all over the world. There are artists that are made aware of different ways of making art and choose to continue to make art in a more traditional way or in the way that works for their environment. And so I want to show you a work of a person in the wilderness from India. Okay, you might be saying to yourself, what is going on? Why has she shown me this work from India from the 17th century when she is talking about the Renaissance? Because we're thinking about the depiction of the human form and how it expresses ideas and feelings. And here is a young lady who is fierce. She has learned that her lover has not been faithful to her. She was upset at home, and then she leaves her home and goes into the wilderness and has some things happen, which I'll tell you in a minute. But when this was made, people would see this in the time it was made and they would hear music. And we all know there are images that we see that we can hear music. For instance, when we see this, when I see this image, I hear the sound of music, right? You hear it too. Those of you who are familiar with this movie, you hear it right now. And if you're, a few years in a different direction, when you see this, you might hear the theme from Game of Thrones. And I won't sing it for you. I even know a dance, but I won't do that either. So that's the same thing that was happening with this work of art. This work of art was a work of art that was made in relationship to a certain type of music. And I've told you a little bit about the story that this young lady learned her lover was unfaithful to her. So you can imagine the kind of music that this must be related to. I'm sure it's not like this, la, 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 right? Right? And she has gone out into the wilderness and she has mollifying these snakes. And notice these animals. Notice their expressions. Uh-oh, watch out, right? The reason I'm showing you this is because here we're seeing this human form depicting that anger, that kind of unhappiness with the situation and being fierce, right? But this was made in one court in India. The artists that made this work were very much familiar with naturalism from the Renaissance. They chose, though, to make this art in a way that was from an earlier tradition in India. They chose that. They wanted to make it that way, just like what we saw with those two saints. This is another work from India in another court. And here you can see that the naturalism that we've been talking about in the Renaissance was very well known to the artists of the region. And we're seeing that recession into space. We're seeing trees get smaller. We're seeing this tree and all of all the leaves and flowers really carefully presented. And of course, these two folks, their human forms are expressing love and caring towards each other in beautifully depicted clothing as well. So that was something that was known in this time frame and was known by these artists, but they made a choice, just like what we saw in Siena. They made a choice to continue to create works of art like this. But now let's look at a gentleman who is alone in the wilderness, but it's a wilderness of another kind. And so when we're talking about the heritage of the Renaissance, one of the things we are talking about is the use of the human form to depict ideas and emotions. And notice what's going on here. First of all, look at the rubble in the front. Notice that this figure is alone in this city, and all of the buildings seem to be empty. Many of them have been boarded up. Notice that the walls here are very naturalistic in the way that they are decaying. And this is a work called Sunday Afternoon by an artist, Huey Lee Smith, who was very interested in depicting a figure alone, whether in the wilderness with trees and so on, or a wilderness like this, a landscape of waste in the city. And this was made in Detroit during a time of great economic prosperity. But many folks were leaving the city and moving out to the suburbs. And so we can see this idea of a wilderness within a city, and this idea of the human form expressing something. Notice that his shoulders are kind of slumped. Notice that he's holding his hands in his pockets and his head is kind of down. And this artist isn't telling us exactly the story or telling us exactly what this person is feeling, but we will all come to this painting and have our own ideas. And you may have an idea of what this particular person is feeling and what the mood is here that this figure helps create, right? I'm not going to tell you what I think it is, but this is definitely an example of somebody who has inherited that idea of using the human form to express ideas and emotions that happened in the Renaissance. And you can see here that there is a recession in space, but it is not precise linear perspective. And so that idea that precise linear perspective was kind of done away with in the Renaissance, towards the end of the Renaissance, as not being something that really is what we see in nature. We're still seeing that same idea here in this work of art. So this is Jesus, and Jesus is carrying the cross. We're back in the Renaissance, by the way. And he is carrying the cross, and you can see that he has a crown of thorns on his head, and he is bleeding, and you can see the blood on his neck. And he is not looking forward. He's walking forward, but he's not looking forward. He doesn't have his head down under the burden of this cross. Instead, he is looking behind him. And what can he possibly be looking at that makes him look behind and not towards where he's going? And what we see when we look behind him, well, he could be looking at this lady perhaps, but he most likely is looking at this. And this is his mother. So we saw Mary and Jesus as a baby and as a toddler. Now this is his mother, and she has collapsed, and he is looking towards her. And notice how on his sleeve we have this blue highlights, the same blue highlights on her sleeve. They are connected not only visually by his view of her, but also they are connected in the way the artist has painted this work of art. And notice how his knees are really burdened with the weight of the cross. You can see that they are bending with the weight of the cross, but his concern is back here. And this work of art made in the Renaissance depicts the moment of Jesus carrying the cross. And you can see now we're looking at the whole scene, and what we have here, Jesus carrying the cross. This gentleman is going to help him. We have the two criminals that are going to be crucified with him. We have his group of people who care for him, and we have spectators as well, right? But there's more going on here, and let's check it out quickly. Because there are three scenes in one here. There are three time periods in one. One is the humiliation of Christ here on the left, and the other is when Christ will be put on the cross on the right. And let's look a little closer just to see. So these scenes there are three scenes here. This is a predella painting, which would have been at the bottom of an altarpiece. But the artist has really put a lot of detail in here, tried to make it look like it must have really looked in real life. You can see too how the artist, and it's nice to see right here, how the artist has used atmospheric perspective, or a kind of a haziness here, to make our eye go into the distance. So a lot of what we heard Dr. Kleinbub talking about in terms of composition, in terms of naturalism, is here, but there is not precise linear perspective. So in this painting, it's just as he was telling us, that the artist went away from that precise linear perspective, instead softened that to make it feel more natural to the people looking at it. But what we're thinking about is the human form and how it expresses ideas, concerns, and connects us with the painting. And that really, this artist did an excellent job of this. That heritage, that idea of family members caring for each other, is going to echo down in the history of art, in the history of Western art specifically, and we can see that here. So what you are looking at, you may say, well, what am I looking at? And that is purposeful, because this artist wants you to slow down and look. She has made this work of art. This is a work of art she made to look dark. She had it printed so it was dark so that you would look. And as our eyes adjust to this scene, what we start to see, by the way, this is called After the Battle by Kollwitz. What we start to see are bodies, right? Bodies all over this landscape. And this person, this is a mother who's come to this place of battle after the battle is over to search for her son, right? So she is looking among these young men to find her son, and she has found him. And so here we have the figure of a mother, the human form, and notice her hand. Notice that her hand is pointed down so firmly. Notice how careworn her hand is. Notice how the light puts us right here. We can't look away. Once we see it, we cannot look away. She has found her son. And this caring, this deep attachment between a mother and her son is expressed here in black and white. And all of us who are parents can be really affected if we look at this too long, because we understand how devastating it would be to be a mother and to find their son in this way. This was actually made by Kollwitz in 1907. And in World War I, she would lose her youngest son during the war. And then this was then published in 1921 between the wars. And then in World War II, she would lose her grandson. And she spent her life documenting the cares of everyday people and documenting connections between those people, mothers and their children, family members, documenting them in a way that makes us understand and feel the pain of the people on the page. And that is the heritage that comes from the Renaissance, that idea of the human form conveying feeling, conveying ideas. And we see that here. But what happens, can a father actually show his concern for his daughter if he's not in the painting? And this is a beautiful scene, a happy scene. So I'm giving you something beautiful and happy after our last work of art. And we are seeing a young lady on a beautiful day. It's a sunny day, although she's in the shade, and it's quite lovely. This was the first work of art that the museum ever owned. And what I'd like you to look at, though, is her face. Because when you look at her face, you can see that it's kind of thin and pale, and perhaps even some other color there. You can also notice that she is leaning on this parasol for support. Notice her feet, they're kind of pointed down. They're not very, they're not settled on this ground, look at the way the landscape behind her is not flat. It's actually, she's on a hill and it's kind of rushing down. And all of those things together make us wonder what else is going on here other than what we see, which is this beautiful young lady on a beautiful day. Well, this was made by Sorolla. This is his daughter, Maria, who was 17 years old and had just recovered and was recovering, just recovered from tuberculosis. And so tuberculosis, of course, a very devastating disease. So here you can see that although he's not in the painting, we can't see him showing his concern. He has painted his concern in the way that he has treated this form. It's quite lovely. The last little section that I want to talk to you just for a couple minutes, and then I'll let you go, is this work by Giorgione. And I think we had such a great discussion of this work. And the one thing that I wanted to point out about this work is that here we have this man, it looks so realistic, it almost looks like a photograph. And there's nothing that tells us anything about him other than his gaze and what his face looks like. So in this time frame in the Renaissance, we had many portraits of many people, but often we would have indicators of their status or other factors when we looked at them. For instance, this is a work about the same time frame from Germany. In this work, we can tell the high status of this individual in this lace collar that he has, in the way that he is dressed, his hat. We know where he lives, what the landscape looks like around where he lives. We know because of this carnation. Carnation was a symbol for love, betrothal, and marriage, that this is probably a painting dealing with either a betrothal, a marriage, or an anniversary, and that another painting would have been painted of a young lady that would have gone with it. All those things we know when we look at this work of art made in the same time frame. This work of art made in the late Renaissance tells us much about this young lady. Made in Florence, we know by the way she is dressed, almost the exact date it was painted, because people in Florence were very much interested in fashion, and the fashion changed so quickly. We know she's of high status because of her jewelry. We know that she is high status because of her gloves. There's a lot that we can tell about this young lady when we look at this portrait. And finally, this portrait of perhaps Prince Philip II, a painting made in Spain by an Italian artist, Sofonisba, who was a female Italian artist. Notice that he is wearing a hunting outfit, although he's probably 3 years old. And that tells us a lot about this person. We know he is of high status, but we also know often that royalty is depicted hunting or in hunting outfits, and that is something that is done because royalty and people who are in power are often depicting themselves protecting or providing for the people that they serve. And so we know quite a bit about this young person just by the way he's dressed. But going back here, this particular painting made by Giorgione tells us none of those things. Giorgione, and we know this was not cut down, Giorgione is asking us to fill in the details. So the story is not being told here to us. We are asked to tell part of the story. And so we are left with the way this person looks and our own background and our own thoughts about this person. And that is a very modern way to make a work of art. And many art historians call Giorgione one of the first modern masters because he's asking us to make decisions about this person based on just what he looks like and who we are. And that is amazing. That is an amazing moment in the history of art. And so I'll end here with a work of art that also has inherited this same idea, made in 1922 by Robert Henry, a young lady, a multicultural young lady who everything has been taken away except for her looking at us and us looking at her and our choices that we make when we look at this work of art. and decide what the story is. So I want to thank you all for sticking with me, and I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a very wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. I want to thank all of you for staying connected with us through our website. And I also want specifically, and I just haven't the words, to thank Ali and Christian for keeping us connected in this unprecedented time with being connected, learning to be connected in so many different ways, with touch and with beauty and with art. Once again, thank you all for being here with us for this lecture, and please add it to your calendar to join us February 19th, same time, same place, for our next lecture. Dr. Ladan Akbarnia, she will be speaking on the planning of wonders, the SDMA's 2024 exhibition on science and Islamic art. It's going to be part of a Southern California wide program that is going to be looking throughout, all the way from the Getty down to the border and maybe across the border, on art and science. Please stay safe, stay well, stay positive, and join us again.